Hey guys, okay, quick one today where we have a look at Bentham and Kant's compatibility with Christian ethical thinking. So this is part 2 of Bentham and Kant. There's already a video up that takes you through the basics of each of them. So if you haven't had a look at that yet and you want to refresh your memory about the main points of Bentham's utilitarianism and Kant's ethics, I would watch that one and then come back to this. Okay, so with Christian ethics on the exam, particularly when we're in this topic or when we're in dialogues, I think it's just worth reminding yourself what Christian ethics actually is, because depending on how you've been taught the course, it can be a little bit easy to compartmentalize and think, well, Christian ethics can only be in what we did on Christianity. Well, that's not the case, because obviously in lots and lots of ethical studies stuff that you will have done, there will be Christian principles in that as well. So I just want to talk very briefly about what we might be talking about if we're talking about Christian ethics. So it can be very general. It can just be some really basic ideas about where Christian ethics come from. So it could be the Bible, and remember that's going to be different depending on whether you are someone who subscribes to divine command theory or whether you're someone who subscribes to situation ethics. In both those cases, the Bible is going to inspire your ethical beliefs, but it's going to do it in a very different way. Particularly for Roman Catholics, church teaching might be very important, the authority of the church. There's a really strong ethical element to that. Many Christians also are ethically inspired by the example of Jesus. They see Jesus as a moral exemplar, as a role model. So those are the general bits. More specifically, we've obviously got the ethical theories we've studied, which come from Christianity. So natural moral law, situation ethics, and or divine command theory, which obviously came up in meta-ethics. Try and steer clear of virtue ethics. That would be my advice when we're talking about Christian ethics, because yeah, there's some compatibility there, but virtue ethics fundamentally isn't a Christian ethical theory because it predates Christianity. So it's best not to get confused. You can go into specific Christian ethical principles that you might have studied in the good conduct topic. So sanctity of life, the just war theory, all the stuff on stewardship and dominion, all of that is fair game as well. A really good tip I would give you though is make sure that you're familiar with Jesus as an ethical figure and some of the most important ethical stuff he said. Everyone's going to know love thy neighbour, and that's fine, but it'll only get you so far. You want some specifics, and a really good place to start if you want to look at some more specific ethical teachings that came from Jesus, I would really look at the Sermon on the Mount, which you can find in Matthew's Gospel. There's bits of it also covered in the topic on the authority of Jesus, where it looks at Jesus' views on pacifism and war. If you want to go back and look at that, that's probably a good shout. On to Bentham and Kant then. Okay, so on the face of it, neither of them seem to have a huge amount in common with Christianity. This is on top of the fact, of course, that they're very different from each other. Bentham was not interested in God at all. His utilitarianism was secular, so it's a non-religious ethical theory. It doesn't refer to God in any way. So on the face of it, it seems to have very little relevance to Christian ethics. You would say at first glance, yeah, there's no compatibility here. Kant's slightly different because Kant believed in God. He just didn't think that God should have anything to do with ethics. So that means that his ethical theory is also secular. He thought it would be wrong that only people who belonged to a certain faith system or belief system should be able to be ethical. He thought everyone was able to be ethical, and therefore it can't be a religious ethical theory. It has to be secular. So it looks at first glance like they're both very secular, but with both, you can also find areas of compatibility, and that's what I'm going to talk you through. But a really important thing is I can't tell you really a conclusion about how compatible these are. That's your job, and that's your job certainly if you're doing an AO2 answer on this, a 15-mark answer. You have to make up your own mind as to how far each one is compatible with Christian ethics. And there's lots of different ways you can argue it. You've just got to pick what works for you. So let's have a look at Bentham. There's quite a few places where there's some agreement. So to start off with, both of them, both utilitarianism and Christian ethics in general, you could argue that they share this goal of promoting the well-being of others. They want the best for people. We can see that in the principle of utility. We can see that with Jesus's teaching to love thy neighbour, serve your neighbours, look after people. There's clearly some overlap there. Secondly, Bentham argues we should promote the happiness of all beings. That should be our kind of ethical goal. That should be our motivation. And arguably Christians have that motivation too. Christian values of love and compassion are there in Jesus's teaching. They're there in situation ethics. They're there to an extent in natural moral law. Things like the synderesis rule. Good is to be done, evil is to be avoided. And they've both got an element of moral duty. Now, you might think that's a bit weird to say that about Bentham because it's a teleological ethical theory rather than a deontological one. But hear me out. They've both got an element of moral duty because Bentham's arguing that you've got a duty to promote happiness. If you're not promoting happiness, you're not being ethical. Therefore, you kind of have a duty to do it. And Christianity teaches that you have a duty, it is right, to follow God's commands, however you arrive at what those commands are. That one's possibly a little bit more tenuous because you could argue, well, yeah, they've both got this element of duty, but the duties are completely different. That doesn't matter because obviously we're going to look at incompatibility in a minute. But the fact that they're both saying that it's good to be good is a starting point that we can do something with. Right, here's where they disagree. So utilitarianism is about happiness and it's about pleasure. Christian ethics isn't always. In Christian ethics, it's not necessarily the priority to arrive at a place where as many people as possible are happy. It's about moral righteousness and obedience to God. That's a different thing, particularly if you're coming at it from a point of view of something like divine command theory or even natural moral law. So this is going to lead to conflict. There's going to be times and situations where they just don't agree. There's also a problem with what they're based on. So Bentham's theory is based on reason and evidence. It's very kind of grounded in the real world. That's why it's an ethical naturalist theory. Whereas Christian ethics rests a lot on faith and revelation from God. So all of that stuff that Jesus did that gives Christians an ethical basis, it doesn't really work if you don't have a belief in Jesus, and that requires a considerable amount of faith. There's a third problem as well, a third disagreement. Bentham always goes for the majority. The greatest good for the greatest number. That's your principle of utility. Christians might be very uncomfortable with that. They might feel that, well, what about minorities? Christians might feel that individual rights have to come first. Bentham doesn't agree. And that justice must always be done. In this case, they've got a different idea of what justice is. Bentham would probably say the greatest good for the greatest number is justice. I don't think a Christian would necessarily agree with that. They would say that justice means fairness to all, not just the majority. Okay, I know I'm going quite fast, and this might not give you everything that you absolutely need, but it will hopefully give you enough to kickstart your revision. So let's go to Kant. A really clear area of agreement with Kant and Christian ethics is that they both emphasise the importance of moral duty applying to all rational beings. A good example from Christianity where we see that is in natural moral law. Aquinas argued that if you can reason, then you can be moral, and more than that, you should be moral, because once you've figured that out, you've really got no excuse. Kant focuses very much on the dignity and worth of all individuals. Now he's only talking about humans, not animals, but remember most of the time Christianity is mostly talking about humans, not animals, so that's not a problem. There's a clear compatibility between Kant's emphasis on this idea that everybody matters and Christian teachings that we've seen on things like the sanctity of life and the importance of treating others well. This is straight out of Jesus' teaching, but it's also straight out of Kant's ideas about never treating people as simply a means, only as an end, and the idea of the kingdom of ends. Thirdly, Kant's ethics is very, very, very rational. So it doesn't rely on faith, it doesn't rely on revelation. You might think that's a problem for Christian ethics, but if you think about it, Christians are expected to think. Christians are expected to use reason and intellect to discern what's right and what's wrong. You do that in natural moral law because you reason out the primary precepts, that gives you secondary precepts, that gives you how you should act. Even in situation ethics, which is different, Christians are expected to think about, okay, what's the most loving thing to do, what's pragmatic, what's personalist, what's relativist. There's a lot of thinking that you have to do. You have to think your way to discovering the right action. And Kant has you do that as well. You know, Kant's ethical system isn't just a set of rules that you follow blindly. And for most Christians, ethics isn't like that either. All right, so finally, some disagreements between Kant's ethics and Christian ethics. Kant is very much of the view that the moral law comes from within. It's something that is within you, that you can access it. And so he rejects external authority. He doesn't think it's coming from the outside. So straight away, this gives us a big problem for things like divine command theory, because divine command theory is all about external authority. Problem as well about intentions and consequences. So Kant emphasizes that the morality of intentions is very important. You have to have a good will, but this conflicts with Christian perspectives like situation ethics, because situation ethics is all about the morality of consequences, doing the most loving thing. It almost doesn't really matter how you get there, but for Kant, it massively does. And then finally, Kant's ethical theory, as far as we've looked at it, you've probably figured out that it's very unemotional, it's very detached, it's very rational, it's very logical in a way. So he doesn't think that emotions and feelings could or should be a basis for morality. But if you read things like the Sermon on the Mount, that's not really true. Jesus' teaching seems to suggest that love, compassion, empathy should guide Christian moral behaviour, and that that's a really good thing. And that's how to be ethical. So I'm going to stop there. As I say, this does not cover the entirety of what there is to know about Bentham and Kant and their compatibility with Christian ethics. But I'm not trying to give you everything. I'm trying to give you something so that you can then go away and build on this, reread your notes, look back at your books, look back at everything that you've discovered so far about these perspectives, and that can help you put it all together. So we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you soon.